Welcome all to the historic Livery Theatre here in beautiful downtown Goderich. We're celebrating salt these days, salt and harvest. We have this lovely young lady here who I should know, but I don't, because you grew up just north of here, you're telling me, up in Port Albert.
Yeah.
And you teach at Western.
I do, yeah.
And I've got this little bio here, and it'll take me a half hour to read it. You've done a lot of stuff. Holy mackerel. You teach at Western. You got a PhD, Master of Fine Arts. You're a smart girl.
Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Oh, we look forward
Thanks,
to
Rob.
This. Yeah, we look forward to this. I'm really not sure what Taylor's talking about here, but she told me it's about theater and salt.
Yeah, that sounds
sure how
right.
that works out.
Yeah.
Actors are worth their salt, something like that. Is that the kind of thing?
Sure.
All right. Please welcome Taylor Marie Graham.
Thank you. Hello everyone. My name's Taylor. For accessibility, I thought I'd offer that I'm a white woman with long brown hair, and I have large brown rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a black dress today. And I'm very honored that I was invited here today to talk to you about theater, ghosts, and salt deposits. And so for those of you who do not know me, like Rob said, I'm a playwright and academic who grew up 15 minutes north of here in Port Albert, Ontario. I want to send a big thank you to Lisa Hood and the Goderich Tourism team for having me. The whole festival is really quite something, isn't it? Last summer, I more or less accidentally came home for this occasion and stumbled through the really wonderful events that were lining the square last year. I walked through wooden crates lined with fascinating salt mining relating infographics. And I talked to salt enthusiasts about the depths of their curiosities on the topic. And I even took a very serious salt-related photo with some friends. On the agenda today, it's working, great. On the agenda today, we'll start with thinking about imagined rural Canadas. Then, that will lead to salt and ghosts, and then theater. And more specifically, the theater I've been studying for the last few years while finishing a PhD in theater and literature at the University of Guelph, the Blyth Festival Theater. And then I'll be sure to leave some room for some questions for about 15 minutes before we finish. And I just sold my last few copies of my anthology of plays, which is Cottage Radio and Other Plays, which are all set here in Huron County. But please feel free to come up and chat with me afterward. Happy to talk and chat some more at the end. Before I get into all of that, I wanted to invite you into this talk today. So just as I'm a real person up here in front of you, you're also real people in the room. Who you are is as important as who I am. We both come to this room with our pasts and perspectives, what we understand about the world and what still confuses us too. So you're invited to participate in a short thought experiment to settle in. Now, I know, the idea of participation in a theater context can strike fear in the hearts of even the most outgoing of people. So please be assured there's no risk of suddenly being pulled up on stage and asked to flap around like a chicken or anything potentially as mortifying. You're free to participate or not. This is an offer to better understand how you might greet the talk today. So, in your own time, in whatever way makes sense for you, makes you feel comfortable, please take a moment to find a comfortable seated position. If available, please put both your feet on the ground. And if you're comfortable doing so, I'll ask you to close your eyes. I'm hearing it already, which is great. Take a deep breath. Lovely. Now, I'm going to ask you to imagine rural Canada. There's no rules about what you imagine, and you won't be required to share this with anyone else. I simply invite you for a few seconds to invite the Canadian countryside into your imagination. Maybe you're imagining an outdoor scene with fields and flowers. Or maybe you're seeing a small hobby farm with people happily working. Maybe you're climbing over rugged mountains or fishing along the ocean. Perhaps instead you have something else entirely in mind, something more abstract than what was just described. Perhaps your experience is something more embodied, a feeling. Maybe it's a good feeling. Maybe instead the feeling or image your brain conjured up for you isn't so positive, and that's okay too. Whatever your experience, just take a moment to take note of what you see or feel. This is your imaginary rural Canada. Thanks so much for participating. Whenever you're ready, you can open back up your eyes. When I close my eyes and imagine rural Canada, I imagine the Lake Huron shoreline. Only a short walk from my childhood home, this body of water really loomed large in my early years. I see stones and sand meeting the water, which expands sea-like in a seemingly endless reach of blue to the other side. My imagination also takes me deeper to a cavern of white far below the surface, where our world's largest salt mine sits under the waves. On land heading east, I see soybean and cornfields in the summer. I follow cars around country roads to abandoned airport runways in Port Albert, Alice Munro's old farmhouse outside Wingham, theater stages in Blyth, high school gymnasiums in Clinton, stagecoach ghosts in Exeter, generations of settler dreams in Lucan, late-night beach parties in Grand Bend, the pretty shops of Bayfield, the delicious cream puffs in Goderich, and everywhere else around, through, and in between this region. I think of all the stories I know from my childhood layered on top of the land. These stories' heroes are often the hilarious Huron County women from my youth. I think of all the Huron track stories from this land that I don't know too. As a theater scholar of Irish, Austrian, and Italian descent, I wonder about the stories I can't see that came before me and will come after me. I think about the lives and stories of the Anishinaabe, the Ottawa, the Ottawandaran, and the Mississauga, the Credit, embedded throughout the shallow hills and farms and small-town main streets of this region. For me, the Canadian countryside is the southwestern Ontario countryside. It's a complex place full of beautiful contradictions that make up a life. Noteworthy sunsets meet rotating thunderstorms. Family bonds meet missing women. Star-filled skies meet pangs of nostalgia. Settlers meet blood-soaked fingers. And highly charged adventures meet the bluff's edge. When I opened my eyes, I remember I only lived in this place for a little over a decade throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. I know my Canadian countryside is different from other people's versions, and that includes the people in this room. That's my imaginary rural Canada. Salt, which I guess is what we're all here to think about at the festival after all. It's really been used as a metaphor for purity, purification, wisdom, and a long-lasting moral code in many works of literature, as well as religious documents. For example, in the Bible, a covenant of salt is meant to symbolize a soul's everlasting purity. Some Hindu rituals purify offerings and sanctify the environment with salt before offering items to the gods. The Catholic Church is said to incorporate salt into their holy water, and they really bump up that percentage in the holy water and add a protective circle of salt when performing exorcisms. Some spiritualists will tell you to drop salt in the corners of your room to ward off bad spirits, and the same is true if you drop a handful of salt on your window before bedtime. Clearly, ghosts have a complicated relationship with salt, at least if you have ill intentions towards the living. But not all ghosts are bad, right? Did you know all theaters are haunted? This is a picture of the ghost light that was placed on the Blyth Festival Theater stage by artistic director Gil Garrett in 2020 when the theater closed its doors because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ghost lights are a long tradition in theater. Essentially, many theater folks are really quite suspicious. I think I would include myself in that as well. According to theater critic Lindsay Wilson, some argue that the function of a ghost light is to chase away mischievous spirits. Others insist it lights the way for ghosts that are said to inhabit virtually every theater, keeping them happy and contented. Either way, that light ensures that no one takes an accidental tumble off the stage. I really like to imagine theaters full of all the ghosts from productions past. Each new play and all the people involved in the production, including the actors, director, designers, playwright, technical personnel, stage manager, box office staff, administrators, and perhaps, most importantly, the audience of each production, they really become ghosts present in a theater's cultural memory. In a book called The Haunted Stage, Theater as Memory Machine, the author Carlson explains that all theater cultures have recognized in some form or another that ghostly quality, this sense of something coming back in the theater. So the relationship between theater and cultural memory is really deep and complex. Theater buildings themselves have the potential to really imbue further meaning as memory machines for those who inhabit their structures. A colleague of mine, a theater professor at Western University, is named Kim Solga. She really gives us another way of thinking about this that I really love. She explains that one of the most influential developments in theater and performance theory over the last century has been the rise of cultural studies, and in particular, cultural materialism, which allows critics to make sense of theater meaning by examining in close detail a theater's building or company and the larger social meaning and context. So for me, the ghosts, which include all the productions of a theater like Blyth's, can tell us a lot about what we find important in culture in the past and today. In May of this year, I defended a PhD dissertation in literature and theater at the University of Guelph. The title of my dissertation is The Blyth Festival Theater and the Imagined Rural Canada. So to give you a bit more context about Blyth, in case you don't know the theater, the Blyth Festival Theater is a professional theater company which was founded in the town of Blyth in 1975. Blyth's about 20 kilometers east of here, and just 100 kilometers north of the nearest city, London, and approximately 200 kilometers west of Toronto. Surrounding Blyth are a number of large agricultural farms. In the town of Blyth, the main drive, Queen Street, is where visitors can find most of the town's industry beyond farming, including the Blyth Festival, which occupies Blyth Memorial Hall's 373-seat auditorium. And then 800 meters west of that hall is the Harvest Stage, which is a 400-seat open-air amphitheater built in 2021, which is also owned and operated by the Blyth Festival Theater. Now, this is what I find really interesting. According to their mission statement, the theater exists to put rural Canadians center stage, telling their stories, sharing their history, and celebrating their way of life. It's really interesting to think that this mandate was decided in 1975 after the theater's first season of operation and really has remained unchanged to this day. In addition to the theater's Canadian rural focus, the organization also has a long tradition of developing and producing new Canadian work. So that means that 59% of the works produced at the festival were new premiere productions of Canadian work. And then this year is a really important milestone for the festival. Throughout the summer of 2024, the Blyth Festival is celebrating its 50th anniversary. And as with all really significant markers of time, this milestone year at the theater provides a really unique opportunity to reflect on the past, to think about that performance history, what ghosts exist in Blyth's past. So in my dissertation, I really wanted to ask questions about this theater history and its mandate. What identities have had a chance to add to the haunting of Blyth's stage and which have not been present? What salt might be in the wounds of the theater's history? How can the theater that is in this community of less than 1,000 people still exist today? What key productions have significantly added to or challenged those past representations of a national countryside throughout its history? Who are the ghosts of Blyth's past, and what do they have to teach us about who we are? So I'll take you back to the beginning for a minute. So who were those first ghosts of Blyth's cultural memory? Blyth Memorial Hall was erected in 1921 after there was a community effort to raise funding spearheaded by the Blyth Women's Institute to commemorate fallen soldiers from World War I. Specifically, the community reportedly built the hall in response to the 1917 death of Private Teddy Maines in France. Local historian Janice Voden explains that Maine's death really rocked the whole community back on its heels because people thought it was just going to be a walkthrough. They thought the Brits were everything and they were sure they could easily win the war. So that was a big shock. As the other horrors kept rolling in, other boys losing their arms or others losing their lives, then the Women's Institute began to think we could have a memorial hall here. So, the Blyth Festival Theater's first ghosts of the region's memory machine were chosen by the community and consciously laid into every brick of their formation, of the structure. This act of respect and honor for their fallen is connected to larger feelings of patriotism as well. The love of local heroes extends a love to the nation because of their loss as part of the larger collective loss felt throughout the country for all the soldiers who did not return from the war. Katrina Dunn, who's an academic I really admire, she explains the Blyth Memorial Hall itself, the building, keeps the community recycling its tragic and intolerable aspects as manageable emotions that can then infuse the space with meaning. So I like to think that the theater's really first symbolic act was to perform the death and life of the region's young heroes and respectfully commemorate their role in the war effort. The young people of the region who bravely fought for their community were commemorated with the erection of this new building, described as a living cenotaph by local historians. It became known as a location for community events and celebrations after it was created. But that building really has lost none of its memorializing function. It's exemplified by the continual annual tradition in Blyth to host Canada Day and Remembrance Day celebrations at the hall. So in those years, between 1921 and 75, the hall was used for a lot of different community purposes, including theater. Soon after it was built, it became a frequent stop for traveling productions on what was called the Chautauqua circuit at that time. And the acts range from vaudeville performances, animal acts, lectures, to more traditional plays like Shakespeare and modern plays written by North American playwrights. Largely an American operation, this circuit featured travel entertainment that was founded by a Methodist camp. It's really interesting to me to note that that circuit really had that first sense of what was performed on that stage. So before Memorial Hall was built, a traveling network was already established in Ontario, and halls and towns near to Blyth were part of that touring network. By 1933, all the so-called Chautauquas had ended abruptly, as, other types of entertainment became more popular, like radio and TV. And like some of the other theater halls in the area, Blyth Hall wasn't converted into a movie theater. The hall was instead generally used for community-centered events and performances throughout the rest of the first half of the 20th century. And according to local historians, there were lots of types of bizarre type performances, so lots of people working together to create little animations of ideas and things that they put together. The hall went through some physical changes, and the theater was not the primary use of the hall at the time. So by the 1970s, that hall was, its future was in question because it wasn't used very much, and they really started to discover that the hall itself, the structure, was in disrepair. There were costly updates that needed to happen to the electrical wiring. There were new codes that really needed to be addressed. So in the early 70s, local newspaper editor Keith Rulston, aided by businesswoman Helen Goling, really encouraged the town to raise $50,000 to renovate the space, which is a lot of money. And not everybody was on side. Some of the community was, some of the community wasn't. Some argued to save the building because it's valued the community as a patriotic symbol, and others because the town inched towards its 1977 anniversary. However, clearly the site did not hold the same cultural significance and wasn't recognized as contributing to the region's economic prosperity at that time. The hall's usefulness and value was not as clear. And so it was still up for debate in 1973 whether they were going to fix that hall. It's really rare that a theater company uses another theater company's production as its founding moment, but that's the case for the Blyth Festival Theater. There's this group in Toronto that was putting together the farm show, this group called Theater Passe Muraille. And I'd like to offer a story of my first encounter with the farm show. So it was in 2005. I was in my second year of undergraduate studies in theater at York University in Toronto. And I remember sitting in a really large theater survey class with hundreds of other theater students studying the various theater movements throughout time, right? From the Greeks to Wozzeck to Brecht to Ibsen. This class covered various temporal periods and geographic locations. And I was sitting there, and there was only 1 week that was dedicated to Canadian theater. And really, to my surprise, throughout this lecture, and really to the rest of the class, we were brought here to Huron County to learn about a troupe of traveling actors from Toronto in the early 70s, and they created a piece of theater here about the farming community just outside of Clinton, Ontario, and really not far from where I went to high school. And I was so shocked. Everybody else kind of turned to me in the room. I remember that feeling because they all kind of knew that's where I was from by then. And I remember, being really surprised that I hadn't ever heard of this before, that it wasn't talked about in any of my high school theater classes. I had no idea. And I think everybody assumed that I had the knowledge about the farm show, but I didn't. I had to learn about it in Toronto. So you might be wondering, what is the farm show? So essentially, in 1972, a theater company from Theater Passe Muraille, they headed Paul Thompson, and there were 6 actors. There was Janet Amos, Anne Anglin, David Fox, Al Jones, Fina McDonald, and Miles Potter. And they all lived and worked in an abandoned farmhouse, an unused barn, just outside Clinton, Ontario. And throughout the play's development, and also as part of that performance. And so this is about a 15-minute drive from where the Blyth Festival Theater sits now. And the actors, they did farm work, and they examined ways of life, they listened to local stories, and they created this piece of theater based on what they experienced. The process, generally, the actors went out to the community, they conducted farm labor to the best of the ability that they could. I mean, they're from Toronto, they didn't know what they were doing. And then they got stories, used those stories, created a piece of theater based on that. So it was skits and monologues and scenes all sort of woven together following 1 year of life on the farm. And all these components were put together, and the story generally follows the changing of the seasons throughout the course of 1 year. 1 minute, an actor may be performing a monologue of an interview they had with a farmer. The next, they could be part of a tractor, so they created, things with their bodies. They made themselves into tractors. And the next day, they could be performing, a child begging their mother for attention. In the published script, the play authors, including Thompson, describes the structure as similar to a Canadian Sunday school or Christmas concert, where one person does a recital, another sings a song, and the third act without a skit, etc. So when this play was ready, the troupe presented it to the farmers, and the production was really popular. It toured across Canada and beyond, and it was this popularity that made Keith Rulston go, this is interesting. People are interested in our stories. Maybe we can get other people interested in our stories. So we invited Paul Thompson to talk at the Blyth Festival, before it became the Blyth Festival, at the hall itself. And I guess it was such a rousing speech. Everybody agreed that they were going to put in the money, and they raised enough money to make all those repairs that were needed so that next year the theater was ready to go. So really buoyed by the success of the farm show, that majority of the community became convinced that Blyth Memorial Hall could be a cultural hub for the region once more. So the hall's new auditorium roof and fire escape were completed just in time for the 1975 Blyth Theatre Renaissance to roll in. So in 1975, 2 plays were produced. One was Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, which is a very popular English play, and a lot of people consider it the longest play running in history. And it was the first and last non-Canadian written production at Blyth. And this was because there was huge popularity for Mostly in Clover, which was adapted by a team of theater creators from local writer Harry J. Boyle's short story collection about his childhood in Huron County. So for years, following the festival season, the community effort to renovate Memorial Hall, to develop the theater, really, that enthusiasm all fused into this year that was really quite successful. So they decided to go with that. We're going to focus on stories about rural Canada. So then I was curious, who is rural Canada according to Blyth? So throughout my dissertation, I asked this question, and I look at different representations of who rural Canada might be. And chapter 3 is all dedicated to the women of the Blyth Festival, who were some of the first folks to really importantly ask questions about other depictions that existed at the festival as well. Female identifying artists have invited audience to see other rural Canadas from a lot of different perspectives. And the works that I think about in this chapter start with an adaptation of How I Met My Husband by Alice Munro, which was produced in year 2 of the festival in 1976. Then there's My Wild Irish Rose by Janet Amos from 1983. And I like to think about this particular story for a few different reasons. Amos herself is a really interesting person because when she was artistic director of the Blyth Festival in the late 70s and early 80s, only 11% of the artistic directors in Canada were women. So she really is a leader in her field. Then I jump ahead to the new millennium and I think about in 2008, Blyth produced 4 world premieres and 3 of them were by women. And this is really notable in the history. And the plays from that year included Against the Grain by Carolyn Hay, Courting Johanna by Marcia Johnson, and Innocent Lost, a play about Stephen Trescott by Beverly Cooper. And each of these works is really quite different and unique in style and structure, but they really commonly explore female agency and coming of age and manage to bind the plays together throughout the season. I also look at The Book of Esther by Leanna Brodie, and I really think about the ways that this opens up questions of thinking about religion and also sexuality. And then I unpacked Prairie Nurse by Marie Bath Baden, and it's a play focused on Filipino rural settler women, a really important play in Blyth history. And a really a funny play, too. It uses comedy in really interesting ways. And then the chapter ends with another Beverly Cooper play. And if you're following the festival this year, you'll see that Beverly Cooper has another play on this year. This chapter ends with If Truth Be Told. So women of very different perspectives and points of view add to this ghostly cultural memory machine at Blyth. I also explore the impact of the Wilberforce Hotel, which is a play that performs both blackface and black lives. And I find it really fascinating that this story animates a story of black settlers in southwestern Ontario that not many people knew about. So Sean Dixon, the play's playwright, really wrote this play looking at the stories of these Black settlers that where now Lucan, Ontario is. A really important work for sure. And then also in this chapter, I look at Black authored works by Marcia Johnson, Cheryl Fogo, and Andrew Moody. And then in 2015, I'm looking at 2 different works by Indigenous authors. That's the first year that we have Indigenous authored plays at the Blyth Festival, which both highlights, a lack of plays produced by Indigenous folks before then, but also a really important moment because it was also the year that we were celebrating Canada 150. So these 2 works by Indigenous authors were making us wonder, well, Indigenous people have been here a lot longer than 150 years. What does that mean? And so those particular productions are really interesting to me in that way. The Berlin Blues by Drew Hayden Taylor is a hilarious play that really pokes fun at this love of Indigenous culture by German academics. I find it hilarious. And then Ipperwash by Phelan Johnson and Jessica Carmichael ran a little bit later in the year. Really looks at this really important story of Ipperwash that happened not too far from here and asks questions about, what does it mean if the Canadian government steals land and doesn't give it back? And asks questions about that relationship between land theft and Indigenous culture. And there's a really important ghost in that play as well I thought I would bring up. So there's a little girl from Ipperwash that haunts the halls of Blyth. So you see her all over the theater, really bringing to life the stories that hadn't been as part of that ghostly haunting that existed in the space before. And so those are the way that I, examine the ghostly cultural memory at the Blyth Festival and their 50 anniversary season. So I really wish those artists, audiences, and other contributors to the Blyth Festival theater community a buoyant, thoughtful, critical, joyful, inclusive, and inspiring next 50 years to come. Thanks. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to chat some more. Thanks so much. Thank you. Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah, there you go. A little bit of Godrich. Boy, she's a good speaker, eh? Wasn't that good? Really well done. Holy mackerel. Very impressive. Very impressive. Come back again sometime. I'd like to see you back. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks.